All right, so it's a great pleasure to be here, and I really wanted to thank the organizers for inviting me. What I've really been trying to do is understand exactly what the contribution that UBE3A overexpression might have to neuropathologies and phenotypes associated with Dup15q syndrome. And as has already been gone over a number of times by now, we know that you have a chromosomal region between the 15q1 to q13 region that you can either have 2 extra copies, as is commonly observed in IDIC15, or 1 extra copy of this region as observed in interstitial duplication of 15. Now, there are a large number of genes in this region depending on where the duplication is and how it aligns along the breakpoints, but there can be anywhere between 20 and 30 genes that have extra copies. So why are we focusing on UBE3A? Well, the reason we focus on UBE3A amongst all these genes is that we know that the penetrance of autism phenotypes with 15q1 to q13 duplications is much higher if the maternal allele or chromosome is copied than the paternal region is copied. Now, this is relevant because UBE3A is the only gene in this region that's only expressed off the maternal allele and isn't expressed off the paternal allele. So this is suggestive, at least, that UBE3A is very strongly involved in the phenotypes observed in Dup15q syndrome. So having either too little or too much UBE3A can lead to neurodevelopmental phenotypes. So we know that with the loss of UBE3A, that's sufficient to cause Angelman syndrome. And 15q1 to q13 copy number variants have Dup15q syndrome, which is associated with autism. It turns out that you can have duplications of just UBE3A and get developmental phenotypes, or mutations in just UBE3A that can cause an overexpression of UBE3A that have a neurodevelopmental phenotype. So once again, this suggests that having either too little or too much UBE3A is detrimental. So one of the papers that I really think is overlooked but is extremely important is this paper right here, in which they observed 5 individuals who had a microduplication that only had extra copies of UBE3A. So only UBE3A was duplicated. And importantly, I would say that these individuals do not have a very typical 15q1 to q13 phenotype, as in most 15q duplication patients. They had some features of autism, but what was most noted was a developmental delay and a little bit of intellectual disability. But these individuals went through high school, some of them even went to college, they had families. So although they did exhibit developmental delay, it wasn't as strong as what you might see in Dup15q syndrome. So this is suggestive that UBE3A is a major player, but it also stresses the fact that other genes in the region are also likely to be important. Yeah. So what I really wanted to do is develop a mouse model that could directly address the role that UBE3A overexpression has in Dup15q phenotypes. I want to stress that I'm not saying that the mouse model we generated is better or worse than ones that other people have generated, but it was designed to answer a very specific question. And the question that we wanted to answer is, what exactly is the role of UBE3A overexpression to neuropathology and behavioral phenotypes? So in order to answer this specific question, a mouse model should have disease-relevant UBE3A overexpression, meaning that it should have 1 or 2 extra copies, as in the most common forms of Dup15q syndrome. So having 1 extra copy in the case of Dup15q, the interstitial duplication, or 2 extra copies in the case of IDIC15. The expression of UBE3A should also recapitulate the normal spatiotemporal profile of endogenous UBE3A overexpression. Mouse model should also produce functional UBE3A that has the same functions as the endogenous UBE3A. And a design feature that we felt was important was that the overexpression of UBE3A should be reversible. And this is important because, one, it allows us to understand the underlying pathophysiology, what are the cell types and circuits of which UBE3A overexpression can cause deficits. but also it can model therapeutic interventions. So you heard from Stormy and Eric earlier that they have ASOs that can knock down UBE3A expression, and you can imagine this could be an eventual therapeutic opportunity. If you want to model the therapeutic benefit of this, then you could have a mouse that can genetically delete the overexpression of UBE3A to model this type of intervention. So these were really the main features of the mouse that we wanted to develop. So with this in mind, Matt Judson in my lab, working with our mouse models core, used a back engineering technology to encode the full-length coding region of UBE3A, along with large flanking UTR regions. So the idea about this is that this would help make it more likely that UBE3A would express all the isoforms under kind of the endogenous promoters and regulators to the extent possible, so to recapitulate endogenous UBE3A expression. Another design feature was that we floxed exon 5 of UBE3A so that we can conditionally delete the overexpressed UBE3A in a Cree-dependent manner. I also think another important feature is that Matt went the extra mile and actually did TLA mapping to look at where the back insertion was. So in mice, UBE3A is on chromosome 7, unlike in humans where it's chromosome 15. And here's just showing you that our inserted, back transgene inserted into chromosome 3 into a region and in a way that we don't think is really disrupting the expression of other genes. And even if it does so, these mice can overexpress UBE3A to physiological levels in a heterozygous manner. They don't have to be homozygous. Now, another really neat feature that Matt Judson thought of in the design was that there was an opportunity to get kind of 2 for the price of 1. So it turns out when back transgenes insert, they often insert in tandem, one after the other. So it's possible to get 1, 2, or 3 extra copies of UBE3A inserted when you're making your mouse founder lines. And Matt took advantage of the fact that you could cross these mice to lead to recombination to presumably get rid of 1 or 2 of the extra copies of UBE3A. So it's possible in the same mouse line, you can have an isogenic mouse that in some cases expresses 2 extra copies of UBE3A, and you can also have founders that overexpress 1 copy of UBE3A. So to focus in on these points of the mouse we're trying to design, I'm going to go through them one at a time now. So in regards to whether we're expressing 1 or 2 extra copies of UBE3A to model the disease, Matt performed a very careful droplet digital PCR to demonstrate that we have 2 extra copies in one of our founder lines. So we have many founder lines. I'm just going to show you data from one of them today. So this is a mouse that expresses 2 extra copies of UBE3A, and we can see that the droplet digital PCR is working because we're getting nicely seeing the 2 LOXP copy numbers as we would expect. Now, once again, going back to this idea that you could take a mouse line that overexpresses 2 extra copies of UBE3A, that have these FRT sites that can then be recombined by crossing mice to these founder lines to a flip-O mouse, and you get a line that only has 1 extra copy of UBE3A. So Matt did this successfully. So we have the exact same mouse that has the exact same insertion site of UBE3A, and we can either have 2 extra copies of UBE3A or just 1 extra copy of UBE3A. So this would model IDIC15 or interstitial duplication. And just to demonstrate this, once again, here's a line that has 2 extra copies of UBE3A. You can see they have a total of 4 copies, so 2 extra copies from what you'd see in wild-type mice. And in this mouse line, which we've collapsed across the extra copy of UBE3A, now we only have 1 extra copy of UBE3A. So this allows us to have lines that are otherwise isogenic, other than either having 2 copies of UBE3A or 1 copy of UBE3A. And I should say, I tend to like an interactive audience, so if you want to interrupt me now and ask a question instead of waiting for the end, please feel free to do so. Okay, Stormy's got a question. It's probably going to be a genetic one that I can't answer.
I'm sorry. I can't remember. Can you, in the OE1, can you knock out UBE3A in that line?
Yes, you can, in a Cree-dependent manner.
Cree-dependent manner, okay.
So
great,
in either of these, you can conditionally delete it in a Cree-dependent manner.
Did you also check just RNA and protein expression, not just copy number?
Yeah, I'll show you that
Okay.
next. Yeah. So this is just a really solid demonstration that the copy number was correct and showing what we wanted to, either 1 or 2 extra copies. And you can get this without breeding to homozygosity, which I think is a key point. So we don't have to take a line that overexpresses 1 copy and breed to homozygosity to get 2. Now, if you look at messenger RNA levels or protein levels by Western blot, you can see that we are getting kind of an expected level of overexpression at the messenger RNA level or at the protein level. So not only are we seeing the right copy number variation, we're also seeing changes in expression levels. So this shows you that we do have a mouse, we have multiple mice in which we have either 1 or 2 extra copies of UBE3A. Now, we also wanted to make sure that the UBE3A that we are overexpressing was expressing in the same way that the endogenous UBE3A was. So the clever way in which that Matt did this, hopefully you can see it. If you can make it darker up here, that'd be great. If not, no worries, I'll talk you through it. But what Matt did is he crossed the overexpressing line onto an Angelman syndrome mouse line. So it has a loss of UBE3A on the maternal allele, right? So this is an Angelman syndrome mouse. This is looking at UBE3A expression. You really don't see anything there because there's no expression off the paternal allele, or at least there's very little. But he took an overexpressing line and he crossed it to the Angelman syndrome line. And you can see that the expression pattern of UBE3A recapitulates that of what you would see in the wild type mice. Okay. So these are mice that have 1 copy of UBE3A, but it's not active because the maternal allele is deleted. These are mice that have 2 copies of UBE3A, but one of them is not active, and you can see the profile of UBE3A expression. These are mice that have 4 copies of UBE3A, so 2 extra copies. And these are those mice crossed to an Angelman syndrome background, so they essentially have 1 extra copy. But you can see that the extra copies of UBE3A, their expression pattern perfectly recapitulates of that what we see endogenously. So this is a really nice, a very strong piece of evidence showing that the mice are recapitulating the spatial profile of UBE3A expression. So another important aspect is the UBE3A that we're producing functional? There are multiple ways to do this. I'm just going to tell you how we're doing it, although we don't have the data yet, is that we're crossing the overexpressing mouse line to Angelman syndrome mice with the idea that this should totally normalize behavioral and anatomical phenotypes. If this does, this is very, one piece of strong evidence that the UBE3A that we're overexpressing is functional. So these experiments are ongoing, and we're simply waiting for the mice to finish breeding. So another key feature is that we can reverse the overexpression of UBE3A. And once again, this is powerful for 2 reasons. If we can reverse the overexpression, we can see what cell types you need overexpression in to get phenotypes. So it gives us some insights into what regions might be important to normalize UBE3A expression in. And we can also model different strategies that would normalize UBE3A expression, such as an ASO strategy to knock down UBE3A expression. So we can model this genetically, and we can do things like map out critical periods for when you would need to do this. So once again, the lighting might not be very good to allow you to see this. This is just a mouse where we've taken overexpression mouse, overexpressed UBE3A. It's crossed to an Angelman syndrome mouse, so all the overexpression of UBE3A is from the back transgene, and then we've crossed it to a next Cree line, so it's deleted the overexpressed UBE3A from all excitatory neurons. So what you're seeing remaining is UBE3A expression just in inhibitory neurons. And you can see like there are a large number, about 80% of the neurons in the neocortex are excitatory, and they're now lacking UBE3A. So this is once again a very strong piece of evidence that we can conditionally delete the we can conditionally delete the overexpressed UBE3A. Any questions at this point? All right. So that's a lot of build-up to what we felt was important for the design features of the mouse, and really where we spent an inordinate amount of our time making sure that we have exactly the mouse that we want to have, both in the fact that it has the right extra copy numbers of UBE3A, that is expressing in the same way endogenous UBE3A does, that it's functional UBE3A, that we know where the extra transgenes have been inserted, and that those insertions of the back transgene aren't themselves causing a phenotype. Now, we're in the more exciting phase of the study where we're starting to look at phenotypes of these mice. And my lab has really been focusing on seizure phenotypes. And we've been focusing on this for a number of reasons. So as everyone in the audience knows, seizures can be very severe and debilitating, and they affect roughly around 63% of individuals with Dup15q syndrome. So it's very pervasive. And seizure outcomes appear to be worse for individuals with IDIC15 than the interstitial duplication. So this suggests that gene dosage plays an important role in the severity of the phenotype. And finally, from work from Orrin Davinsky and others, we know that sudden unexpected death with epilepsy is a serious concern, especially for individuals with IDIC15. So the absolute worst outcome of a seizure is death, and we know that this is observed in individuals with Dup15q syndrome. So it's a really large concern that we need to address. So our mice that overexpress 1 or 2 extra copies of UBE3A are going to be very important in allowing us to determine whether UBE3A gene dosage is contributing to seizure phenotypes and or to SUDEP phenotypes, this unexpected death in epilepsy. Now, there are a number of ways to study seizures. I'm going to show you one of the ways that we've been using, and that's to induce the seizures using an inhaled drug that's a GABA receptor antagonist, and it's called fluorothil. And what we do, we put the mice in a chamber, we let them habituate for 60 seconds, and then we add fluorothil to the chamber, and we're waiting until we see the mice have a seizure, and then we remove the fluorothil. So we're looking at how long it takes until the mice have a seizure from the onset of fluorothil exposure. And if they're really resistant to seizures, they can last a very long time in the fluorothil. If they're very sensitive to seizures, they'll only last a short time in the fluorothil before they have a seizure. So it allows us to gauge seizure severity. But we can do more than just study seizure severity. We can also study epileptogenesis. So one of the really bad outcomes of seizures is that seizures beget seizures. So once you start having seizures, you can become more and more likely to have subsequent seizures. So this is called epileptogenesis. So it's a maladaptive plasticity in the brain that increases your susceptibility to seizures. And we can model this in the mice by exposing the mice to fluorothil on 8 subsequent days. So on day 1, they'll get a fluorothil seizure, fluorothil exposure until they seize. Same thing on day 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So they get 8 days of fluorothil exposure until they seize. And then they'll get a 4-week incubation period, and then they'll be retested to see how much their seizure susceptibility has increased. Now, wanted to show you what we've done previously with Angelman syndrome mice so you can see kind of the power of this approach. So this is looking at how long it takes for the mice to seize. So the longer it takes, the more resistant they are to seizure. The shorter it takes, the more susceptible they are to seizures. Okay? So just view this as more seizure resistant, more seizure susceptible. So if you're looking at now wild type, and these are Angelman syndrome model mice, these are not the Dup15q mice yet, these are Angelman syndrome model mice. You can see on day 1, Angelman syndrome model mice are a little more susceptible to seizures. On the 8th day, they actually have the same seizure susceptibility. But something really remarkable happens after this 4-week incubation period. You come back and you look at seizure susceptibility of Angelman syndrome model mice, and it's very, very low. They're highly susceptible compared to wild type mice. So what this means is that Angelman syndrome model mice are very susceptible to epileptogenesis. So they are more likely to be susceptible to epileptogenesis than neurotypical mice. Okay? So that is, once they start having seizures, it's more likely that they'll continue to be more susceptible to them. Okay? Now, what did we see in the mice that overexpress 1 or 2 copies of UBE3A? Well, these are the data to date. We have done about 32 wild type mice. We've had 9 mice that overexpress 1 copy and 6 mice that overexpress 2 copies that have made it all the way through this 36-day protocol. And we see something very different from what we saw with the loss of UBE3A. What we see is there might be a slight increase in seizure susceptibility on day 1 in mice that overexpress 2 copies of UBE3A. But really across the 8 days of fluorothil exposure, there's really not a difference in seizure susceptibility. Okay, how long it takes them to have a seizure at least. And if you look 4 weeks later after this incubation period, so you look at kind of this epileptogenesis, they're not different either. So what you see is that the mice that make it all the way through this procedure have the same epileptogenesis as neurotypical mice. So it suggests that overexpression of UBE3A might cause a little dose-dependent increase in initial seizure susceptibility, but it doesn't necessarily increase epileptogenic potential. The initial seizure, at least for the first exposure with 2 extra copies of UBE3A, there's a slight increase in seizure susceptibility, but it's not maintained across the 8 days of exposure. So right now we're looking, we're really focusing on fluorothil. These are pretty labor-intensive studies, and we only have so many mice. We don't want to do the same induction models. But you can look at PTZ models, you can look at canic acid, you can look at electrical kindling. These are all things that can be done, but there's, of course, limited time and resources. But these are things that we'd like to do to see how generalizable it is to other forms of seizure induction. Yeah, it's a great question.
So Ben, you mentioned that sort of you've qualifies for the animals that have gone through the entire 36-day
Hold
period.
that thought.
Okay.
If I don't answer it in the next 3 slides, ask it again. So there is an increase in seizure severity. So there's a seizure score from having like just a myoclonic kind of twitch to having something more severe like a generalized seizure, or to having forelimb extension or hind limb extension. So if you look at, once again, the mice that make it all the way through the procedure, there's an increase in seizure severity, so that on day 5, all the mice are exhibiting generalized seizures, and by day 36, the mice tend to have tonic forelimb extensions when they're seizing. So this is just an indication of how severe the seizures are. So once again, these only reflect the mice that completed the entire kindling protocol. So, yeah.
So the previous slide says that it's generalized, right? So what is your criteria for the previous slide? You said that the threshold to seizure, is it generalized seizure or to what stage?
Yeah, so once they go, we observe when they have the first myoclonic twitch and we record that. Then we wait till they're generalized, and once they've generalized, we remove the fluorothil. So the fluorothil remains in there until they have a generalized seizure.
And then you're categorizing their highest severity score after that.
That's my understanding. You should ask Matt Judson in my lab for the precise thing, but yes.
Okay.
Is generalized loss of writing, or is it tonic extension?
I think lack of writing, you can once again, I would refer to Matt Judson and Ben Gu. So Ben Gu in my lab trained with Jim McNamara, who's kind of a famous epileptologist, so we're really using his guidance for exactly how to do the scoring, and I'm not in the lab anymore other than directing things. So I'll direct you to them. But please just email me if you want a precise answer, and I'll put you in touch with Ben and Matt. Now, where things were very, very different actually was survivability. So if you look at the number of mice that survive over different fluorothil exposures, you can see that mice that overexpress 1 or 2 copies of UBE3A were dying at an increased rate. Okay? So this is suggestive of an unexpected death with epilepsy because the severity wasn't any worse. So once again, another way of looking at that, if you look at mice that go into kind of a stage 6 seizure versus a less severe seizure phenotype, the same proportion of mice were advancing to a stage 6 seizure, whether they were wild type or overexpressing 1 or 2 extra copies of UBE3A. But what was really disproportionate is the number of mice that died once they reached this tonic hind limb extension. So less than half the wild type mice died if they reached this really extreme stage of seizures, where almost all the mice overexpressing 1 or 2 extra copies of UBE3A died if they reached that extreme state of seizure. So,
Question?
yeah.
Oh, over here. So if you include the animals that have been dying and you sort of put those in the data points from the previous slides where it only had like 8 of the double overexpressors and 6 of the,
Yeah.
does that change then? If you include all animals as overexpressors, does it change the threshold then? Or is there only no difference when you just look at animals that?
Yeah, I'd have to have Matt throw those numbers back in because I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay, thanks.
So once again, these mice aren't any more likely to experience a stage 6 seizure, but if they do, they're more likely to experience death from that severe seizure phenotype. So it's suggestive that it's very similar to SUDEP. Now, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's fine.
But my question is, here you're dying because of a seizure, correct? And you're dying in the process of a seizure, which is very different from SUDEP, at least with what we know right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the process of SUDEP is very poorly understood. So a lot of the ideas at SUDEP is that there's an advance of a seizure to brainstem areas that can lead to loss of respiration, but there are also forms of SUDEP that are linked to cardiac deficits. So one of the things that we'd like to do is really use these model mice to study that. And that's, I think for the parents in the room, it's obviously hard to hear a story about SUDEP and that there's an increased chance of death with epilepsy. But the promising note is that we can now use this to try to study SUDEP and what's the mechanistic underpinnings and then try to develop preventative measures to prevent this. So we don't know whether this is due to a cardiac change. So we can look at things like QT intervals and other things that are cardiac related, whether it's due to a respiratory change. All of these things are things that we can and will study. So we'll drop in chronic electrodes into the brainstem, into the brain. We'll measure cardiac function. We'll do all of these things while we're doing these types of studies. And what the goal is to use these mice to understand why there is increased death with epilepsy from the overexpression of UBE3A. So once we have that understanding, then we can start to build preventions that can really, hopefully help these individuals who have Duke 15q.
You may have mentioned it, but I think I'm not enough.
They want to capture it on the video. That's why they want to. Yeah.
Thank you. So you may have mentioned it, but what's the age of the animals when you initially tried to trigger the fluorescent seizures? And when was it the last time? And the question behind that is, how could that have affected young versus adult animals and doses and thresholds and so on and so forth?
It's a great question. I don't know the answer. I'm pretty sure Matt is starting between P70 and P90 on these, but once again, email me and I'll get the exact answer for you. So we're probably modeling it a little bit later developmental stage than you typically see this. But SUDEP, you can see across a relatively broad range in the patient population, often starting around when individuals are teenagers going into their 20s. So I think it's appropriate to model it at a young adult stage, which is what we're trying to do.
Great. The only thing I'd just like to make as a comment is it still is not SUDEP in the sense of the word. So that link is tenuous.
I would call it a SUDEP-like model. I mean, it's very difficult to model.
It is death by status epilepticus,
SUDEP
perhaps?
has to be something that's spontaneously arising. So this is a SUDEP model, and I'll try to be more appropriate in my terms and not using the term SUDEP. We might be able to observe SUDEP if we crossed it on a different line, but one of the things we wanted to do, we wanted to use a mouse background that was actually relatively resistant to seizures, so we could watch the emergence and what's causing the susceptibility. So we've been screening actually 30 different lines of mice to look at their seizure susceptibility. And C57 Black 6 is consistently one of the most seizure-resistant lines. And we are much more susceptible lines. So if we really want to model things like the spontaneous seizures and to have a more accurate of what a kind of a spontaneous unexpected death with epilepsy would be, then we would need to turn to one of the more susceptible lines. So
Sorry,
I
last
should
question.
more appropriately use, it's a SUDEP model, but it's not technically SUDEP. You're correct.
One last question, sorry. Do these animals become epileptic?
Do they become epileptic? That's a great question, and we don't have the answer to that yet. So normally after the induction period, even in C57 wild-type mice, you'll see some spontaneous seizures, but not that many during that incubation period, but you will. So I suspect that you would see some seizures. I don't know if that seizure incidence would increase or not. We don't have the answer to that. We have to do the chronic LFP EEG recordings. Yeah. So, yeah. No, you can ask as many as you like. Yeah.
I'm just trying to understand why we consider this a SUDEP model, just to follow up on the comment. This is a status epilepticus or a seizure-related death, but it's not SUDEP.
Yeah.
This is death in the setting of an actual seizure.
Yeah. I tend to use it because it's shorthand other than saying seizure-related death, but I will try to be more precise because you're exactly right. It is not SUDEP per se. It is a seizure-associated death or seizure-induced death.
But I think the pathophysiology is probably very different of one to the other. That's what I'm trying to say, that this assumption that this is related to SUDEP, I'm not sure. I have no data to contradict
I'm not
this.
sure that's
right?
it's safe to assume that they're different.
No, but it's not safe to assume that they're the same as well. That's what I'm trying to say. I have no data for it or against it, but in clinic, death from a seizure
I think
is very different
I would
from
counter-argue, I don't disagree with you, by the way, so I do agree, but I'd also say to study SUDEP is very difficult because you have to model spontaneous seizures across long, long periods of time and wait for it to occur. So to find a methodology that allows you to study SUDEP, I would challenge you or anyone else in this room to come up with a good model for it. So I would counter that this gives us the best tractable model to study a seizure-associated death. Yeah. And that there's a good chance that the underlying pathophysiology might be the same. The fact that we see increased death with seizures with UBE3A overexpression and that individuals who overexpress UBE3A have enhanced SUDEP, I would say in my favor of the argument that there might be a common pathophysiology that could contribute. If you have a way of studying SUDEP, like bona fide SUDEP, I would love to hear it because I think we'd really like to do that in the end. I think the point is that with a seizure induction model, it can be very different from a naturally occurring seizure. And once again, I don't disagree with you. One of the things we've been doing to try to get at this, and this is really a tough question, so once again, I agree with you, but I'm not sure I have a better model, and I'm open to discussion about a better model. But one of the things we're trying to get at this, we've been screening 30 different lines, these collaborative cross lines that are bred to be very genetically diverse. And then we're taking each of these lines and we're trying to study them to see which ones have seizure-associated death and things like that. And once again, we're finding lines that are susceptible to fluorothil-induced death, but we're not seeing spontaneous death, which is very difficult to capture. I would say that we have a hint. We might have a line that does this, in which we do a complex deletion of UBE3A from a specific cell type. These mice die spontaneously, and we think it could be to a SUDEP-related phenomena, but we'd have to capture them in the moment of death. And since it's not a very frequent occurrence, it's very hard to capture and categorize. But I'd be thrilled to talk to you offline because I feel very strongly about this subject of the importance of everything you're saying. And once again, I agree with you 100%. But the challenge is trying to find a way to model it experimentally. But at the very least, I should be more precise and not use the word SUDEP, but I tend to use it as a shorthand because it's the quickest way to capture a more complex concept. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I had a non-SUDEP question, but since we're on the topic, I think it's true though that it's really hard to make a SUDEP model since we don't really know what causes it. So it's hard to model something we don't understand very well. But so my question was with the Angelman mice. I think what you're seeing is what we see in humans too. They can do great for a long time, get a little cold, have a couple seizures, and just snowball into a non-convulsive status. So that's really pretty accurate. For the overexpression, the epilepsy is, the humans seem a little more epileptogenic. So do you think that's because of other genes being overexpressed?
Yeah, I mean, once again, the caveat is that the seizures in mice are very strain dependent. So we always have to place that caveat upon it. And unfortunately, to get at that question, you'd have to put it on probably 5 different strains to get a decent idea of how penetrant the phenotype is, and that's not very realistic unless you have near infinite resources. But I would say based on what we've seen, it's suggestive that a lot of the other genes in that region are really contributing to seizure severity. So we know that like GABA-R beta-3 and other GABA receptor subunits are there. And I would hazard a bet, and I think there's probably evidence from people in this room, that they're helping to contribute to the seizure severity.
So I appreciate so much what you've done, and I really, really, really like the way you made this mouse model. I think it's very comprehensive and thorough. I'm dying to ask you this question, though.
Yeah.
Why not start with the EEG first over the behavioral seizure where you were going to... Do you have EEG that shows an abnormal?
We have, it's a really, the fluorothil model is a really strong model for inducing seizures and for rapidly kind of assessing whether or not there's a seizure or death with seizure phenotype. So it really started with that because it's very straightforward. But obviously EEGs are ongoing and will be done.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
I just feel like you had to kill so many of these mice that couldn't have been cheap or not labor. These are really, I mean, we do these type of induction experiments in our lab, and they're extremely laborious, and it costs tons of money and animals and time, and I feel I'm just dying to see what their baseline EEG is.
Yeah.
Particularly since you have several copies. It's beautiful.
I should also add that Payman Galshani has these mice. So he's really been looking at EEGs and other aspects of, so we kind of also held off since he's really taking the lead on that. We'll be doing some of our own studies, but Payman Galshani probably has a lot of data on these mice already. So I think I've answered all of the questions. And I'll note that I used seizure-associated death down here instead of SUDEP, and then flipped to SUDEP there. I apologize. But thank you, everyone, for your time and attention. I appreciate it.